Hello everyone, Jim Lynn here. Welcome to episode 8 of Mr. Lynn's Workshop. Now at the end of episode 7, if you recall, I mentioned that in this episode I'd be looking at sharpening the router plane blade and the skew block plane blade and the marking knife blade. Well, I've changed my mind on that. I decided that it might be a better idea to do a more in-depth look at each tool to include how to sharpen the blades. I think that makes more sense. So we're starting off today with the Lie Nielsen No. 71 router plane. So the first thing is, it is a router, it's not a router. Comes from the verb to route, which means to gouge out or scoop out material to create a groove or a recess. That's exactly what this plane does. That's pretty much all it does as well. The electrical version is also called a router. It does a similar job. It's probably more versatile given the amount of bits that you can fit to it, but does have the downside of sometimes eating your fingers. This knurled knob at the top engages a ring in a top slot of the blade there and makes the blade go up and down. There's a depth stop there on the blade, and there's a securing screw in the body of the tool which holds the blade tight. Now notice that engages onto the corner of the blade, which means that the blade won't twist in use. Very useful. Also provides a really secure grip as well. Now I'm going to set the tool up for adjusting, and the first thing I like to do is to back the blade off, in other words retract it into the body of the tool, and then with the tool on a flat surface like the workbench, I advance the knurled knob clockwise until the underside of the blade tip touches the bench. Now I know that that tip there, the underside of that, is coplanar with the underside of the tool, so that's a good starting point. So I'm just going to secure that in place and loosely drop the depth stop downwards. Now to set the brass depth stop, the first thing you have to do is move the depth stop itself out of the way so it doesn't get in the way, unsecure the blade so you can adjust it, and then turn the knurled adjustment knob clockwise to advance the blade downwards below the surface of the body of the plane to the depth that you want it, the final cut depth. Then secure the blade in place with the securing screw, and then just drop the brass depth stop down and tighten it. Now that's you secured your final depth of cut. So then slacken the securing screw and back the blade off to take a shallower depth of cut. Of course you want to take many shallow cuts rather than one huge cut, unless you really want to rough something out rapidly. And that's how you set the cut depth on the tool. Looking at the underside of the tool, you can see there's a channel either side with some through slots. They're there so that you can fit an auxiliary fence to enable you to cut rebates on the edge of a board. So we'll have a look at that next. This is the fence with its retaining screw. An odd shape at first until you realise it's for two purposes. This is the straight side, and this side here is for doing rebates round a curved board. Now the finish on this piece is a little bit rough, so I'd have to do some fettling first before I used it. So you can see there's 3 screw holes there to take the screw, but I'm going to set this up in the middle one first of all. So I like to put the screw through the slot and then kind of engage it into the threads a little bit, just to make sure it's secure and not going to fall out, and then I'll drop the fence into the slot on the body of the plane and then just tighten it up. So if I slacken off the securing nut of the fence and move it as close as it will go in the middle screw hole, you can see that it still leaves about 10 millimeters off the edge of the blade, so obviously you want to be able to cut rebates that are less than 10 millimeters. So all you have to do is change screw holes. So I'll unscrew the securing screw and put it in the outermost hole in the fence and tighten it up. Now I did find that this particular screw hole was quite tight to screw in maybe there's a little bit of swarf left in it from manufacturing. I haven't actually screwed this screw in here before, so I just had to resort to the Lie Nielsen screwdriver. Now I'm setting it about 1 millimeter shy of the side of the blade, just to show you. See how close it can go. Obviously it can go right up to the blade if you wanted to, and a good few looking down from the top. So the next thing we're going to do is take the blade out so that we can sharpen it. So the first thing I do is slacken off the depth adjust and the securing nut, and then I'm going to turn the adjustment knob anti-clockwise until it comes off its thread. It sounds a bit bizarre, but it's actually a bit fiddly. It comes off its thread and then you have to kind of wiggle it a little bit just to get it to come completely free. And once it has come free, you take off the depth adjust. Sorry, not the depth adjust, the depth stop, and give the blade a dunt until it falls out. And now we're ready to proceed to sharpening. This is a Veritas skew registration jig, and I'm just using it because it's got angle markings on it. So if I slide the blade along, the top surface of the blade there is ground at 30 degrees. So then I turn the blade around and slide it along the other direction. I can see that the underside of the blade is also ground, and it's ground at 5 degrees. So I'll put this square onto the skew registration jig and then the blade up against it. This little piece of aluminium represents the surface of the wood, so you can see that 5 degrees is the clearance angle between the wood and the blade, and the upper side of the blade is that 30 degree mark, and that's what the wood sees. The wood sees 30 degrees. So when I come to sharpen this, I'm going to just polish the very tip of that upper 30 degree bevel. This is my setup for honing the tip of the router plane blade. I've got my 10,000 grit sharpening stone sitting on a piece of cherry, which is just to raise it up to the correct height, and the whole lot sitting on this gripper mat. So having worked out that the difference between the lower surface and the upper surface of the blade is about 25 degrees, I've set the stone up here so that I can polish the tip at roughly 30 to 35 degrees. The exact angle isn't important as long as there's a decent clearance. So now I'm going to just spray a little bit of water on the area of the stone that I'm going to be using, and then set the blade back on the stone. Now you can see that the slot on the blade post at the lower right there is sliding on the upper surface of the workbench, and everything is nice and parallel now. So all I'm doing is moving the blade gently backwards and forwards on the polishing stone just to polish that very tip. That's all I want. The final step is just to draw the underside of the blade across the polishing stone just a few times, just to make sure there's no little wire edges left at the tip of the blade. The final result, a nice little line of polish right at the tip of the blade. It's time to reinstall the blade, so obviously goes from below into the square slot. And then we'll put the depth stop back on and secure it somewhere in the blade just so that it's out of the way. Supporting the blade with a finger from below so we've got some control. Take the depth adjuster and engage its ring into the slot on the blade, and then try and engage the depth adjuster itself onto the screw threads. This is a little bit fiddly, it takes a little bit of practice, but eventually you get the hang of it. So there we have the depth adjuster working fine, looking quite smooth. Well, that's the Lie Nielsen number 71 router plane setup and blade sharpening, everyone. Of course, all these tips will work on any router plane, doesn't matter what make it is, they're all pretty much of a muchness. But anyway, if you have any questions about anything you've seen in the video, please write them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them. But that's it for episode 8, everyone. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.